For a long time, the God of War series has kept itself cemented in gaming history as one of the most important and influential action games of all time. First taking shape from inspirations such as Devil May Cry and Onimusha, with a higher emphasis on spectacle, and then rebooting itself later with inspirations from story-focused titles such as The Last of Us. So, as a celebration for the successful release of God of War Ragnarok, and the conclusion of the Norse saga, we've decided to rank the God of War games from least good to best. So without further ado, let's get started. We'll be kicking things off with God of War Chains of Olympus. It's a testament to the quality of the series that the game that is arguably quote-unquote the worst of the series is still a highly competent title on its own. Chains of Olympus was the first of the two God of War games that came out on the PSP. Developed by Ready at Dawn Studios, developers of the Resistance franchise, Chains of Olympus was a true showcase for what the PSP was capable of, translating the spectacle of the home console PS2 titles into a dinky handheld to amazing effect. It also helps that Chains of Olympus has a very good story, and arguably one of the most emotional endings of the series. Confronting Kratos with the loss of his daughter makes for a very emotionally resonant story, which makes Kratos seem like a much deeper character. As to why this game lands on the bottom, this was God of War's first foray into the PSP. Couple that with the PSP's limited buttons and you have an experience that feels more like God of War Lite than a proper entry. Even still, God of War Chains of Olympus is a great title that deserves to be played by every God of War fan. Number 7, God of War Ascension. God of War Ascension was where the series started to lose a little bit of its steam, and after 5 games using the same admittedly great combat style, players wanted something new. Despite being a great prequel to the series and showing a younger version of Kratos, it wasn't enough for players who were starting to get tired of the series formula. In this case, hindsight serves really well, and looking back at God of War Ascension in a vacuum, one can find a superb action game that has probably the best rendition of classic God of War signature combat style aside from God of War 3. One can also find a game that has aged really well despite all the negativity it received when it was launched. Coming so late into the PS3 cycle and following God of War 3, this was at a time when the PS3 was finally starting to show its age a little bit. This made the game feel really inconsistent to play with because of frequent frame drops as soon as combat got hectic, which, in a game like God of War, happens pretty frequently. It's one of those games that could have greatly benefited from a PS4 remaster like God of War 3, but unfortunately this entry remains locked to the PS3. Number 6, God of War Ghost of Sparta. God of War's second foray into handheld is also its most successful one. Giving more insight into Kratos' past and putting his brother Deimos in the forefront, God of War Ghost of Sparta once again tells a personal and emotional story that feels right at home with the other games. The combat shines on the PSP as Kratos takes on a whole new roster of bosses and enemies alongside a new arsenal of fun and powerful weapons. This time, the presentation eclipses even Chains of Olympus. It's hard not to marvel at the visuals of this game considering it was running on a tiny little box and it manages to churn out visuals that are pretty much right at home with the home console releases. This was among the best of the PSP era alongside games like Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, Resistance Retribution, Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, and many more. In 2018, Sony Santa Monica once again revived the God of War series with style. This was number 5, God of War 2018. Rehauling the approach to storytelling to make it more cinematic in the line of similar games like The Last of Us, God of War continued the story of Kratos, now living in another realm with different rules and different gods. Having annihilated an entire pantheon in the last game, this was a fresh new start for our beloved god-slaying douchebag. Now, raising a son and traveling to the highest peak in all the realms to spread his wife's ashes and fulfill her dying wish. God of War 2018 gets a lot of things right. The writing for its entire 20 to 30 hour runtime manages to be consistently great across almost the entire game, minus one specific segment halfway throughout the game. The story has a lot of emotionally powerful moments, such as, well, spoiler alert, from Kratos taking out the Blades of Chaos to the wonderful ending that recontextualizes the entire game. It's one of the few AAA titles that actively benefit from a second playthrough because of the ending. However, even for everything it gets right, it's not a perfect game. The pacing in the last act is fairly monotonous. There's one point in the story where the quality of the writing just plummets into the ground and the game barely recovers from it. The combat is too restrictive, and the tight camera makes combat cumbersome during hectic encounters, and the platforming, if it can even be called that, is automated to an abysmal degree. As good as the game's narrative is, its numerous small flaws make for a worse experience than many other games in the series. Number 4, God of War 2005. The game that cemented an undying legacy. The original God of War set a baseline for the series and was the game that introduced everything that the players would cherish about God of War. The spectacle, the satisfying QTEs, the combo-heavy combat, it all started here. God of War, even today, has aged spectacularly well. Juggling enemies with the Blades of Chaos and hacking them apart with the Blade of Artemis is as satisfying today as it was in 2005. What is more surprising, however, is how good it looks. God of War manages to convey scale and scope in a way that not even its reboot has managed to capture. There's an insane amount of detail put into every environment, and this first game puts most other games on the system to shame in visual fidelity. Playing it today, there are still moments that would have your jaw on the floor. Hearing the music swell as the camera pans out to an incredible vista, this was the game that defined the word epic on the PS2. It's also a game that is surprisingly dense with puzzles and platforming challenges, frequently asking players to solve a quick puzzle through exploration or do various platforming challenges. Unlike its 2018 counterpart, platforming is also much more active with frequent enemy encounters while you make your way across pits and climb up obstacles. While a huge focus on them would hold the game back, God of War is paced just well enough for you're constantly moving forward and making progress in some form or another. The parts that do show their age, however, are its combat encounters. While landing brutal combos and executing enemies as Kratos feels satisfying as ever, it doesn't feel so great when there are these lengthy, tough encounters with enemies that can take a ton of punishment while feeling like they're spawning endlessly. But that could just be because we played it on hard mode for this video. And it's only a slight issue in the game that seemingly gets almost everything right for a PS2 action game. Number 3, God of War Ragnarok. The sequel to the critically acclaimed reboot of the series launched to a rousing applause from gamers and critics alike. Iterating upon what made God of War 2018 so special and ironing out most of the complaints levied against that game made Ragnarok a worthy successor to the franchise. Featuring the same heavy-hitting combat that made 2018 so good, Ragnarok expanded upon the combat even further. On top of that, the game also alleviated one of the biggest issues present in the last game, its lack of boss fights. Ragnarok features some of the most insane and fun boss fights in the God of War series to date. It reaches the same heights as some of the best moments of the Greek trilogy and then one-ups them even harder. Unfortunately, all this praise aside, Ragnarok still suffers from poor pacing, aggressive handholding, and frequent downtime between gameplay. Characters constantly spoil the puzzles and tell you what to do, and there are long stretches of moments where all you do is talk. All you do is engage in conversation. However, when Ragnarok is firing on all cylinders, it is an untouchable experience. It's to God of War 2018 what God of War 2 on the PS2 was to the very first game. Speaking of God of War 2, that would be the game that changed everything. While the first game established everything the series would eventually be known for, God of War 2 perfected it. Intense set pieces, epic boss fights, beautiful vistas. God of War 2 cemented everything that the series would be synonymous for in the future. Refining the combat from the original game even further, God of War 2 pushed the PS2 to its absolute limit, resulting in fights that look jaw-dropping to this day. Starting your game off with a boss like the Colossus of Rhodes and then only going up from there is a feat very few games could ever manage. It also established the most iconic antagonist of the series in the form of Zeus, as well as the rivalry that endured between him and Kratos until the end of the third game. There were many sequels in the PS2 era that established a bold legacy for the respective series. Devil May Cry 3, Yakuza 2, Metal Gear Solid 2, all of that, and God of War 2 was able to join that pantheon with ease at the end of the PS2 era. And at this point, you probably know what it is, God of War 3 for the number 1 spot. The original send-off to the Ghost of Sparta, God of War 3 was a monumental title. Not only concluding a long-running saga of blood and vengeance, but also managing to do it with the gusto of a proper finale. As far as spectacle goes, this is the best the series has ever been until Ragnarok. Playing the PS4 remaster results in an experience that feels mechanically and technically flawless, even in 2022. While criticized for its short length, The brevity, in fact, ended up helping God of War 3 significantly. This is a game that absolutely atomizes any idea of filler and just keeps delivering new ideas at a consistent pace. It's a game that starts things at an 11 and ends itself at a 21 and embodies the best of the series in a single brief package. While the game did suffer in its story, one sequence involving a certain princess being particularly egregious by the way, it's a game that satisfies almost all beasts that a God of War game should, having the best combat of not only the series but also among many in the genre. Engaging puzzles that aren't too easy nor too difficult, and some of the most insane set pieces in all of gaming. While this would admittedly be a contentious entry among many fans of the newer games, God of War 3 was and still is a phenomenal title that feels the best to play in the entire series. While some of you may have found certain entries in this list to be particularly bizarre, remember that everyone's personal mileage may vary. God of War is a spectacular series that has almost never hit a terribly low point. How would you rank the God of War games? Feel free to tell us in the comments below, and remember to subscribe to the channel. Thank you.